in this particular matchup, what do we have on the Michigan side? What are your thoughts about watching the Wolverines play and at times struggle through this 2017 season?
Well, I think when we saw Michigan play Florida, we thought that would be kind of a barometer of what this team was made of going forward. And now looking to see what both of these teams have done throughout the season, it didn't really tell us much at all until Michigan got into the Big Ten schedule and had to face that really tough conference schedule. The East is a gauntlet at the moment, and they were not able to go through it unscathed. Win-loss unscathed, and then also with injuries unscathed. I think the injury to the quarterback for Michigan, two quarterbacks now at Michigan have been to not only the detriment of this offense, but it was kind of like the death blow to Michigan's offense that was already struggling to begin with.
Yeah, Wilton Speight is not a great quarterback. He's a tall quarterback, and he's a fairly mobile quarterback, and threw a key interception to Malik Hooker last year in the overtime loss in Columbus. He did have a nice season last year. They won 10 games, finished in the top 10, almost won the Orange Bowl, lost by a point. And he comes out this season, throws 2 interceptions for pick sixes against Florida. But other than that, he was doing the Wilt Speight kind of thing. And then he went down against Purdue. They brought in John O'Korn. And the history of this guy is interesting in that he burst onto the scene at Houston with Kevin Sumlin. No, Kevin Sumlin had moved on since then. So anyway, he was playing for Houston. His freshman season, through 28, 29 touchdown passes, was the conference freshman of the year. Looked like he was going to have himself a fine career there, but then he was beaten out for the job. He transferred. He gets to Michigan, and the job was up for grabs. Speight won it. O'Korn waiting in the wings. He gets on the field this season after Speight went down, and he was just awful. 1 touchdown, 5 interceptions. The offense has generally been very atrocious most of the season, throwing the ball downfield. And now we got Brandon Peters, who's a much anticipated freshman, and he has been a workman-like option. So he hasn't made a lot of mistakes. 4 touchdowns, no interceptions, hasn't really turned the ball over, although he did fumble inside the Wisconsin 5. That was pretty costly last week near the end of the first half. But now he's banged up, hurt. His status is questionable. So we probably, because of gamesmanship, won't find out who's going to take the snaps for Michigan at quarterback this Saturday.
And Brandon Peters is still in concussion protocol. It would be very Jim Harbaugh-like to not say anything. And you know, good on him if he wants to do a little gamesmanship and not let Ohio State know who to prepare for. If they're preparing for O'Korn is not the freak on a leash, is not a typically mobile quarterback, and their offensive line is not prepared if he is particularly mobile that day. He also doesn't have a great pocket presence. So with a defensive line that Ohio State has been dominant this year with tackles for losses and sacks, it's going to be a long day for John O'Korn regardless. And the other problem is if Brandon Peters or John O'Korn have decided to step up and be quarterback that day, hasn't caught a touchdown pass for Michigan since the win over Cincinnati September 9th. So that's quite a long way to go. They do actually have talented receivers at Michigan. They just have not been able to haul in any real scoring. So that's going to be a difficult thing for them to be able to have a dynamic and balanced offense if they don't necessarily. Now, obviously, they've had tight ends and running backs catch a ball, but it's difficult when it's very predictable and pedestrian.
Claire Crawford joining us from the Ozone.net. Join her right there with her co-host Joe Dexter on Oh Hail No. It's their weekly podcast on Ohio State football. John O'Korn has really played 3 to 4 meaningful games this year. So he came in relief of Wilton Speight, who I believe fractured his vertebrae against Purdue. hit on 18 of 26, played fairly well, threw a touchdown, threw an interception, and Michigan broke open a tight game. The big game for him and the big letdown was against Michigan State. So that was in the rain. Michigan State hung on to the ball. Michigan couldn't, largely in part to John O'Korn throwing 3 interceptions against Michigan State. And that's what really sent the Michigan football team unraveling this year in regards to contention in the Big Ten. Not that they've come unraveled. They're 8-3. They're a good football team. Against Indiana, he threw for Claire all of 58 yards, and that was an overtime game. So they play extra time. He still only throws for 58 yards, but they handed the thing to Karan Higdon over and over and over and over. He had over 200 yards, and they survive Indiana. The Penn State game, he didn't really have awful statistics, but they didn't move the ball. They kept it close for about a half. Then they got completely blown out in the second half. He went 16 of 28 in that game. Then last week, once Brandon Peters went down against Wisconsin, it was still a game. It was they had a 10-7 lead actually in the third quarter of that game. Then it was 14-10, and Wisconsin started to move the ball and get some offense generated. Peters goes down. He comes in, and talk about not leading a comeback. 2 for 8 for 19 yards, and they lose by 2 touchdowns, 24-10. So John O'Korn having his issues this season. So unless he comes out with a game of his life, or at least a game from 2014, he has not been a very good quarterback since.
Out of Ohio State Michigan games, that's the beautiful thing about this rivalry, is that we've seen the statistics on paper, and we've seen these two teams unevenly matched, and one team ends up surprising the other at times. So it's great as a fan to know all that stuff ahead of time, and I agree with you. That's what we do. We try to guess to see what's going to happen. But in all reality, that's the beauty of this game, is that especially with it being in Ann Arbor, and this Ohio State secondary has had issues in big games this year, staying disciplined, especially in a road environment. I think as Buckeye fans, none of us are resting easy on the fact that all of these stats are stacked for the Buckeyes' favor.